Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 106, and I'm delighted to welcome back onto the podcast after a very long time when I checked the date of our last conversation, Damian Hughes. Damian, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me back, Ben. I'm like a bad penny, keep turning up. But hey, thank you, and congratulations on episode 106. Is a sign of your consistency. So thanks for having me on, and congratulations.
Thank you, mate. No, when I checked, it was actually January 2019 was our conversation, which is crazy.
Flipping heck.
So yeah, I appreciate you coming back on. It's been well overdue. And
Yeah, thank you.
I know you've been massively busy because I've been keeping up with some stuff that you've got going on, but I'm sure there's other stuff that I don't know about. So do you want to give a little brief, because people can go back and they can listen to episode 11 with yourself, because I know you go into your background and everyone that you've worked with on that. But do you just want to give a bit of a brief background and then a bit of an update as well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So say people having to go back. So my name's Damian Hughes, and it's easier to explain what I do in terms of three different roles, really. So one of the roles I do is I work as a visiting professor at Manchester Met University. My background is in organisational psychology and change. So looking at how do you build strong teams and strong cultures that can then cope with the pressures that they'll inevitably come under. The second job I do is I work as a consultant across quite a wide range of organisations, so from business to education, but predominantly most of it's in elite sport, working with coaches to develop high-performing teams and cultures. And then the third job I do is I write, and since we last spoke, I've started to co-host a podcast as well, which fits under the same bracket, and it's called the High Performance Podcast. And that's what the books are around, about how do you create high-performing teams and cultures. And that's what the podcast does. We just chat with high performers around some of those same principles. So yeah, it's easier to explain what I do through the lens of those three different roles.
Now, I'm sure many of the listeners, if not all the listeners, have listened to at least some of the podcasts. And I've just been saying to you before we started recording that I'm thoroughly enjoying them. I think the sort
Thank
of
you.
The guys that you're targeting, not just in sport, but the business guys as well. There's so many lessons in there, and it's something that I do want to dive in with yourself on this podcast as well. And just initially, like, what are some of the biggest lessons or reflections? Because you've spoke to a number of different people on that podcast now, from a range of different areas. So what are some of your initial reflections or takeaways from it so far?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Ben. And well, first of all, thanks for listening to it. Because we've almost tried it out, the idea of it. So I keep saying we should explain that I co-host it with Jake Humphrey, who is the football presenter on BT Sport, is where most people might know him more through Formula One previously on the BBC. So Jake and myself host it together. And we've been really lucky. We've sat down with people from the likes of Ole Solskjaer, Frank Lampard, Sean Dyche, Mauricio Pochettino from a football coach's point of view, through to business leaders like Michelle Mone and Holly Tucker, the lady that's out not on the high street. And then we've also spoken to people like Marcelino Sambe, who was the principal lead dancer for the Royal Ballet. So we're talking to like quite a diverse collection of people, and the principle is around getting them to explain to us what high performance is and how they got to deliver such sustained, consistent high performance. And I think there are some really common themes that come out of it. I think one of the first themes that really has intrigued me is they know what they know, but they equally know what they don't know. And that taps into a concept that is referred to as the Dunning-Kruger law. Now, the Dunning-Kruger law is named after two psychologists at Stanford University, Dunning and Kruger. And what their idea says is that if you're clever, or if you're talented or good at something, you're smart enough to be able to explain why you're good at it. Now, on the flip side, if you're bad at something, you don't understand. Explaining this is, if you ever watch a coach after a game, coaches that get beat after a game, the ones that seem to understand it come out and explain what they didn't do. So they might say, oh, our intensity wasn't good enough, or our passing wasn't sharp enough, and they internalize it. Coaches that maybe don't get to that same level come out and externalize it and blame the referee or the opposition. So they don't know why they didn't perform because they don't understand it well enough, is the idea behind it. And this has been really interesting with all our high performers. When we speak to them around high performance in their world, they're really eloquent and can talk in detail about what it's taken and the sacrifices and the commitment and the lessons they've learned. But one of our interesting things is when you say to them, how do you do this as a parent, or how do you do this as a partner? What's really interesting is their humility kicks in and they go, I don't know. So Dylan Hartley, the former England rugby captain, was a really good example of this on an interview that he was telling us about his disciplinary record and how he had to play on the edge to feel like he was contributing to the team, and how he'd sort of left home at 15 from New Zealand and become independent, and how that had forged him. And then we were saying to him, right, you've got 2 young children. How do you take these high performance lessons and apply them with the kids? And he was like, I don't know, mate. He said, I've got no idea because I'm learning to be a parent and I've not got any expertise in parenting. So I'm almost trying these ideas out. And I think that was a really neat summary of how they know what they know, but equally they know what they don't know. And so they're just as equal to be curious and to learn and to ask questions if they feel it can aid their performance. So there's a humility behind all of them. I'd say another big factor that comes out is that they all have really clear non-negotiable behaviours. So it just removes any ambiguity from their world. So they'll tell you, these are the rules of the game. If you want to come along with me or you want to work with me, these are the rules of the game now. I know when we spoke on podcast 11, I shared with you some research I'd done at Barcelona, and I'd spoke about this idea of non-negotiable behaviours. But that's important for an individual or for a culture, that you say, this is what we expect. So we've interviewed the likes of Solskjaer, as I mentioned, Rio Ferdinand and Robin van Persie and Phil Neville. So they all came through that era of success at Manchester United. And what's interesting there is they talk about 3 non-negotiable behaviours that Ferguson just laid down and they were expected to buy into. So they were the idea of relentlessness, that you play to win, you just keep going after the win. The second one was courage. You've got to put your balls on the line. You've got to really take a risk. And then the third one was you've got to be a team player. So there's a really nice exchange that we had with Rio Ferdinand, where he was telling us a story about how there was one occasion where Dimitar Berbatov didn't make a run across the field to show for a ball. And Ferdinand says he absolutely laced into him. And Berbatov had said to him, oh, he said, relax, what are you worried about? He said, at Barcelona, you don't have to run like this. And Ferdinand had said, well, fuck off to Barcelona then. This is Manchester United. And you work hard, you're relentless in terms of your work ethic. And if you don't want to do that, go somewhere else. And what he was talking about there was, it wasn't a personal argument. It was an argument about behaviours, because he saw it as incumbent to defend the culture. So they all have these kind of non-negotiable behaviours. I'll give you another nice story from it, that when we interviewed Chris Hoy, we were due to meet him. We were meeting in the Northern Quarter in Manchester, and it was 10 o'clock. It was a really cold, wet day, and 10 to 10, the knock on the door, we opened the door. Chris Hoy's waiting for us, and I was like, oh, thanks for coming in, Chris. And we were chatting, and I said, oh, thanks for being here on time, really appreciate it. And he was like, why would I not be on time? And I was like, well, no, I appreciate it's difficult to find, it's cold. He went, no, we've arranged to meet at 10 o'clock. I'm here for 10 to 10. And then I thought, this is a thread worth pulling. So I said to him, it just sort of exploded with him. And he was like, listen, if we arrange to meet at 10 o'clock and I turn up late, he said, that implies that I think my time is more important than yours. And by definition, that implies that I think I'm better or more important than you. And he went, I'm just not having that. That's just not the person I am. So when we explored that, and non-negotiable behaviours for him was, do what you say. So if you commit to do something, do it. Be reliable. And treat everyone with respect and dignity. Now you go, do those 3 non-negotiable behaviours manifest themselves when he was winning 8 gold medals? You go, yeah, definitely. Because when he committed to do something, he went all out for it. You know what I mean? He treated his competitors and the people that were there to support him with respect, and he was relentless in terms of doing the right thing. So you see all these things sort of emerging, and that's what we've really noticed in the interview. So there's a humility, and there's also a really clear-eyed idea of this is what I stand for. This is what I'm not prepared to compromise on.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned about the family and the parenting side of it as well, because that was really fascinating for me. Because I know you spoke to, I think it was Phil Neville that talked about getting the kids up and training before early in the morning. And obviously you mentioned about Dylan Hartley then as well. And I think some of them realise that their levels are so high. Like Neville's obviously trying to maximise absolutely everything, isn't he? But Hartley is probably doing the same, but without necessarily realising it, I'm guessing.
Yeah, very much. I think like it's a good example you mentioned with Phil, because he was fascinating. I've been lucky enough. I've worked with Tracy, his sister, when she was doing the England Roses. So I know that there's some family values that are inherent in both her and the two brothers. But to hear Phil articulate it in relation to a competitive world like Manchester United was fascinating, because he told the story about when he left Manchester United and he went to Everton, and I asked him how he coped, and he said he used to go to the gym before training at Everton just to do his prep work and to do a little bit extras, and he said that they took the piss out of him. They laughed at him, they called him teacher's pet, they made him feel silly for doing it. And then he said eventually when he just didn't waver from that non-negotiable about like getting up early, doing the best you can. And then he said eventually 4 or 5 other players started turning up with him in the gym, and he was sort of humble enough to recognise that he'd played a part in shifting the culture at Everton to become more professional. But that's not something he just did in work and was different outside of it. He spoke about how that was the same standards that he'd applied as a father. So he spoke quite movingly about his daughter was born with cerebral palsy. So realised that, you know, there was some physical disadvantages that she was going to have to overcome, and he just refused to allow them to become an excuse. His point was, you can still get up, you can still work to your capacity as best you can. So again, I think this has been a really interesting insight that people can take away from it, that these people don't just do this every now and again. It's not just an occasional thing, it's an everyday thing in terms of their behaviours that drives the consistency. So, I mean, if you don't mind me saying it, it's a bit like that reference that we made at the start. For you to get to 106 episodes is a sign of consistency. Do you know what I mean? That anyone can do the occasional podcast, but to churn out the quality relentlessly that you do with the questions and your insight and things like that is a sign of consistency, and that's what all high performers have in common.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for that. On the Neville thing as well, Damien, I think one area that's really fascinating with that, because I really like, every time you talk about culture, when we spoke on the episode, loads of things have sort of stuck in my head, and especially the cultural assassin, the cultural architect. Ever since we spoke about that, that's the first time I'd ever sort of heard those phrases used. But now, since that point, every time I look at a team or work with a team, you can point them out a mile off, can't you? And externally, sometimes I think you can. But like in the Neville example, people looking from the outside wouldn't know that he did that, and he could have that big an impact on that culture by simply going and doing those gym sessions every morning. But over his time at Everton, obviously that was a big change in the culture by the looks of things from the outside. But we talk about culture a lot on this podcast in terms of creating culture. And obviously, a lot of our listeners are S&C coaches and sports scientists, so we talk about gym culture a lot in football. But it's very, very different to a lot of other sports, like rugby, for example. Like the rugby players, it's just bred into them that they do the gym, they go all out in the gym, whereas football isn't the same. So it's really interesting that for me that Neville was seen as such a an outsider or so different to what they were doing normally. Whereas a lot of people would probably think, oh, elite footballers, they must train really hard in the gym and prepare themselves in a professional way.
It's a brilliant point, Ben. I think, but I think that like Frank Lampard gave another good insight to this when we spoke with him, that he spoke about coming through at West Ham's academy and how he used to stay behind and do extras. That he was sort of like his dad had been a former footballer, and his dad had said, you don't compromise on this, you work harder than the opposition. So he was constantly in the gym doing extras after training just to keep himself topped up. And he spoke about how like people took the piss out of him. People they use that horrible term in football that you're busy, and they called him busy, and they thought that he was doing it, but he knew where he wanted to go, and he wasn't prepared to compromise his standards. Now, what was interesting is in a separate discussion, Rio Ferdinand said that it was seeing Frank Lampard do those extras that prompted him to go, maybe I need to be doing this as well. So he would then go to Lampard and say, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Can I join in with you? And it almost became a competition between them to see who could keep their standards high. Now, that to me is a perfect example of what a cultural architect can do, that somebody just sets the example, and then you'll get others that will then seek to come along with them or aspire to join in with them. And a cultural architect embraces that. The cultural assassin is the guy sat there laughing at you or undermining you or trying to take the piss out of you for doing it. And that these are all subtle ways of seeing how this either builds and enhances a culture, or it just chips away and undermines it.
No, I think it's a really important point for coaches working at any team in any level of football, because we'll all be able to think of people that match those descriptions straight away, whether it's currently in a squad that you're working with or a squad that you previously worked with. I can think of a number. And we spoke again recently with coaches that have talked about changing the gym culture in particular. So getting players into the gym and comfortable within the gym, and potentially using things that are a little bit attractive for players that they like doing. It's not necessarily something that the coach fully agrees in. But if they could get them into that environment, then they can make the impact.
Well, it's a really good point, Ben. I think that when we talk about trying to change behaviour or trying to tempt people for this, it's very difficult because you can create the environment. So if you're a coach in the gym, you can create the environment of sort of like creating the culture and having your non-negotiable behaviours of when you come in here. I think it's important you clarify, in this domain, these are the rules of the game that you're signing up to, and explain why they're there. So they're not just rules for the sake of it. They're almost guidelines that explain that you turn up, you do your prep. So if you remember on the last example I spoke to you, that I grew up as the son of a boxing coach. So my dad ran a boxing gym in North Manchester, and he had really clear non-negotiable behaviours. And the one that I sometimes refer to is the fact that you weren't allowed to use bad language in the gym. That wasn't a moral reason of not swearing offended anybody. It was the fact that it was a boxing gym, and the idea was that if you can't hold your tongue, so if when you're faced with something, your immediate response is to start effing and blinding, that indicates a lack of discipline, that you can't keep your mouth shut or find an alternative term. And if you lack discipline to do that, you'll lack discipline when you go in the ring to follow the game plan. And if you lack discipline, you're likely to get hurt. So there was a really clear alignment between that behaviour, that non-negotiable behaviour of discipline, and how it related to bad language. So it was just an easy way of manifesting it. So as a coach in a gym, if you can articulate, these are my 3 non-negotiables and this is why it's important, I think that can help enhance it. But in terms of trying to spot cultural architects and their equivalent, the assassins, there's 2 ways in which you look at it. So there's 2 ways anybody makes a decision. So if you think about it from, if you're trying to get a player to come in and commit to doing extras, there's 2 ways that we all make decisions. One way we make a decision is we do a cost versus benefit analysis. So you go, what is the benefit of me coming in and staying behind for an extra hour and doing some work here versus what are the consequences? What am I missing out on? So some people will make a decision cost versus benefit. And if you can articulate enough costs for them, they'll do it, right? The other way people make a decision is they make a decision via identity. And when you make a decision via identity, what you do there is you ask yourself 3 simple questions. You go, who am I? What's this situation I'm faced with? And what would somebody like me do in this situation? So the difference there is you'll notice you're not worried about cost versus benefit. You're worried about doing the right thing. So if you see yourself as being like the Chris Hoy example, I'm a down-to-earth bloke that does what I says I do, and then you can depend on me to deliver. You turn up at 10 to 10 for a meeting, even if you've got other things going on. No, I've committed, I'll be down there. So he's making a decision via identity, not cost versus benefit, because there was no benefit for him to turn up early. The consequences, we couldn't impose any consequences on him. So he did it because he turned up because that's his identity. That's just who he is. So we all make decisions via cost versus benefit, or we do it through identity. Now, what you need to do is that as a coach, if you're trying to get people to come and commit to this, you need to be able to tap into both. So you need to be able to give people enough benefits as to why you're doing it. And then you also need to create the environment and the culture that means that people enjoy being there. But also there will be people there that have this sense of identity, and you need to tap into them and almost make them your superstars, make them your cultural architects, give them authority, give them the ability to lead by example, and you almost use them as the role models because they will take people along, like Phil Neville and his example demonstrated at Everton.
Yeah, and we can all think of people that fit that mold, can't we? Like, I don't know if we mentioned about Roy Keane in the previous episode, but I had Mick Clegg on the podcast.
Oh yeah, Mick's great bloke. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he came on, and his was fascinating because he's obviously talking about that era of Ronaldo, Van Nistelrooy, Beckham, Keane.
Yeah.
And you look at that sort of changing room, and I know you've done a lot of work with behind Ferguson and about the approach that Ferguson's taken, as well as a number of other clubs, like you mentioned about Barcelona. Well, that dressing room in particular is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because there's some characters in there and some people that we know, famously know a lot about, and the impact that they can have.
Yeah, but so I know Mick, and I know how impressive he is, and I'm sure he recounted the story of Cristiano Ronaldo turning up on his first day and saying, "How can you help me be the best player in the world?" And then Mick sort of coming in early with him and doing the boxing sessions and the weight sessions, and then the stuff with the weights on his ankles for training afterwards. And I know Mick was integral behind that early stage of Ronaldo's meteoric rise. But you look at that's a guy doing it because whether it's cost versus benefit, and he's gone, I feel like this is worth my while. But equally, he's done it in the shadows. He's done it when nobody else is watching, and he's doing it even when players might be laughing at him. That tells you that very clearly it's an identity thing. It's an identity that he just sees himself as being the world's best footballer. And he identified that early on and then committed to doing everything to make that happen. So, like, I know some of the guys at United that have told me stories about going to his house when he was living in Manchester, and said like his house was set up and was just purely designed for him to be the world's best footballer. Yeah. So his fridge was stocked full of all the right food. He had his gym that he would go and do some prep work in himself. He had facilities that meant that when he came home, he could recover fully. So this was a guy that his whole identity is built in. That how do I get the very best out of myself?
And that identity, like, because you see that in some players, don't you? And that's not necessarily to make it as the best in the world, but it might be to play in the Champions League, play in the Premier League. They have it sort of set in their mind at an early age that they're going to achieve something like that. Well, then how can we as coaches impact that? Because if players are struggling for the opposite of that, and they're struggling for that sort of, whether you call it motivation, or struggling to create that identity or that vision of what they're going to be, like, what do you think are some things we need to be aware of in having an impact on players?
It's a brilliant question, Ben. I'd say there's a great interview I did many years ago with a guy called Angelo Dundee. Now, Dundee was the coach for Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard and lots of other great world champions. And when I sat down with him, I kept using this phrase about fighters. I kept saying, what was it like to work with this fighter? What was it like to work with that fighter? And he stopped me halfway through and he went, Damien, he said, I don't work with fighters. He said, I think you misunderstand. So what do you mean? He said, I work with young men that just happen to fight. And he went, it's the people bit that's key. And it almost was a brilliant articulation of this idea that you're working with people as opposed to athletes. Do you know what I mean? You work with young men that play football. You work with young men that want to compete at a certain level. So I think you've touched on a really important point here, that it's the people element that we don't underestimate and that we shouldn't overlook. And I think we need to understand their story. We need to understand where they've come from. We need to understand their ambitions, their drivers, their fears, their beliefs. And when we can try to understand something about the human being that we're working with, then we can start to understand about how we can either help them on that journey or otherwise. So I think there's an element of, don't underestimate the value of that social glue, of just spending time talking to them rather than just doing it as a tick box exercise or getting into immediately how do we interact with each other in terms of the business side of it. That again, there's another great boxing coach that I did a book many years ago about a guy called Thomas Hearns, who was a 5-weight world champion. And when I went to Detroit, his coach was a man called Emmanuel Stewart that went on to train Lennox Lewis to the heavyweight title. And he used a lovely phrase. He said, I work on the basis of contain, then explain. Contain, then explain. And what he meant was that he said, I think I'm the best coach in the world, so I can explain how to make you a better fighter. He said, but that would work on the basis of I'm trying to explain and then contain. He said, but if you're not convinced that I care about you, that I'm interested in you, that I know your story, your background, your history, you're not going to listen to me. When times get tough, you're not going to listen to me. He said, so you always need to make the time to develop that trust and that relationship before I start to try to coach you. And it's a more long-winded process, but it's the one that creates that longer term success, because you will have bad times, you will have shit moments, we all do. But what gets you through those moments is that you trust each other and you know that you can look out and rely on each other. And that only comes through having the strength of relationships that can sustain you through those bad moments. So it's a long-winded answer to a really good question, Ben, but I'd say don't underinvest in the strength of the relationship with the person behind it long before you ever start trying to convince them of the benefits of coming in the gym and the different knowledge and experience and wisdom that you're going to share with them.
Yeah, and to relate it back to the high performance podcast, that was one thing that I took massively from some of the guests, that you hear the struggles that a lot of them have been through. Like you mentioned Michelle Mone about the whole divorce and the ex-husband and all the story behind that. Yeah. But then to relate it to football as well, the Lampard story, that I think people look at him now and obviously see him in his current role and forget the sort of abuse and the way he was like, well, it kind of picked on in a way, wasn't he? Like he was targeted, and that was. I know we'll maybe touch on it later, but that was sort of pre-social media as well. This is sort of press and.
Oh no! Well, I read a story in his book. What was really interesting was when I was doing the research, I got his book and I was reading it, and he told the story, and it really tickled me, but not to laugh at anyone. It was more like the way he recounted it was, he said that there was a kid where he used to sit when he was on the bench at West Ham. He said, and there was a kid who sat 2 rows behind him, about 14, and he used to be shouting all kinds of vile abuse at him. He said, whenever he used to get up and warm up, this kid would just be shouting like constant, like just filth at him. And he said he was always conscious of this kid, that he was there. He said, and then where he grew up in Romford, he said he was in the bank one day, and the woman working in the bank said to him, oh, I'm a big West Ham fan, me and my son go regular. So he'd said, oh, I'll meet you before a game and come and say hello, bring your son. And he said, and when he met her outside the ground, the son that was with her was the same kid that sat behind shouting all this filth. And it made me laugh that he said that it ran through his head of, should I tell her what he does? And he said he also thought, should I tell her that I've caught him smoking at the games? So he does make light of it, but I'd said it to him. I said, what really struck me there was, because then when I went back and checked his age, he was only 21, Lampard, when he was in this situation of being faced with somebody that was tormenting him and abusing him, and then having to be polite to him, which is what he did. He shook the kid's hand and signed his shirt. And it sort of it made me laugh, but in many ways, it also made me feel really sad that for a lot of these guys that they are going through that struggle. And I think when you understand there's a human being on the other end of it with all their kind of insecurities and difficulties, I think it's really interesting. There was another lad who was really fascinating, a lad called Reece Wabara. Now, a lot of people didn't necessarily know who he was beforehand, but he was a kid that had come through City's academy, ended up playing a couple of first team games when Mancini was the coach. And then City let him go and he sort of drifted down the leagues, played for like Doncaster and Bolton and Wigan, before he set up a fashion business now called Manier Devoir that is turning over like 20-30 million pounds a year. So he's been incredibly successful. And what interested me was speaking to him around his experiences at City. And he said, you know what, I was focused on the wrong things. He said, I was a young boy. I had a flat in the centre of Manchester. I was driving a really souped up car, making a lot of money, had lots of girlfriends coming round. I was wearing all the bling. He said, and I got a reputation that stuck. And what was interesting was he said that it took him a while to realise that some of the senior players at City used to encourage him. You say, you keep wearing those clothes, you keep driving that car. It's brilliant that you're expressing your individuality. He said, what I didn't realise was these were the guys I was competing with for a first team place. He said, and they were neutralising me by being kind to me and pointing me in the wrong direction. And he said, and unfortunately, he felt that nobody came along and tried to understand him, that a lot of his behaviour was born out of insecurity, that he was driven, although the bling and all the things that people judged him to be, a lad that wasn't focused, was born out of his own insecurity. And he said the people that directed him in the wrong direction were people that had a different agenda than him. But he said he never felt he got anyone that tried to just understand him as a person. And he felt that reputation stuck all the way through his subsequent career, which was why one of his big inspirations of setting up his own fashion business was, he went, I'm in control of it. I'm not at the whims or subject to anybody else's opinions or prejudices. So you're absolutely right that I think when you try and unpeel it back and see that everybody's going through their own struggles, and I think that's why the best coaches are the ones that can really engage with the person rather than just the athlete.
I think that highlights a key responsibility of a coach as well. The fact that we're not just coaches, we're kind of mentors as well, aren't we? We're there to, like you say, help the person, not just the athlete.
100%, absolutely 100%, Ben. I think that's a really powerful point that you're making. That, yeah, I think as a coach, don't get me wrong, this isn't about being somebody's mate. This isn't trying to be overly familiar with them. You know, I've seen lots of coaches fall into that trap in many ways, that they try and be overly friendly and then find it difficult to then get it back on a professional keel. So it's not about trying to impose yourself on a friendship, but it's about just coming at it with kindness and empathy and understanding for the person engaged in that struggle or that particular challenge that they're going on with. You know, again, I'll quote another interview that we did with Sean Wayne, the England Rugby League coach. You know, and I think his story seemed to resonate with a lot of people because his childhood was brutal. But one of the phrases he told us was, he said, I don't have a single pleasant memory of my childhood. That he says his dad, from even when he was like 7 or 8 years of age, his dad, who was a big man, would sort of set about him 2 or 3 times a week and give him a good hiding. And he says, I don't have a single pleasant memory from up until he left his home at the age of 15. But he feels that experience has made him the coach he is today, because he said, no athlete will ever come into my company and feel afraid. No athlete will ever come and that I won't invest time to see the person that lies underneath that title of being an athlete, and that if they're behaving in a, so he says one of his criteria for selecting players is, he says, I listen to how they speak to staff at hotels. And if they're rude or abrasive or obnoxious, I go and have a word with them quickly and say to me, that's not you. That's not the person that you can be, you know, and that's not the person I want in this culture. And just challenges that kind of behavior. Now, he's not trying to be their friend. He's not trying to be something he's not to them, but he is being a mentor, as you say, just to guide them in a more helpful direction.
Yeah, I've got to say, I'm not by any stretch a rugby fan, but I think his was probably my most enjoyable episode.
Oh, right, brilliant.
Just because I think it was like you say, so brutal in terms of upbringing, but the lessons and the way he spoke about what he'd learned from what he'd been through was so powerful, I thought.
Yeah, I think it takes, it goes back to that phrase that I said, that all of these guys that we've met, there's a humility to know what they know and equally know what they don't know and learn from it. And I think one of his other experiences was that he said when he was a young player, a rugby league player, and he was just let go. Coach just said, I don't want you anymore. And he had to go and find a different club. And he said that I'll never let any player get treated like that as long as I'm in charge of them. That if I ever need to let them go when we terminate a contract, they'll know long in advance why we're going to do it, what our rationale is. And there's a support network in place to help them move on to the next stage of their career. You know, and so I think there's a humility there to take these experiences, which in some cases are really traumatic, and turn it into triumph rather than let it define them in tragic terms.
Yeah, definitely. And when I was thinking about some areas to talk about, Damien, one thing sprung out to me, and I wanted to get your opinion on it. So an episode, again, a while back with a coach called Gary Kineen. He works over in the States, an Irish coach.
Oh, yeah, I know Gary, Northern Irish guy that's incredibly successful over there. Great blog.
Yeah, quality. So he mentioned about S&C coaches or sports scientists having the first interaction with players a lot of the time, whether that be on a training pitch or a match day. So when you go out initially, you'll generally see the S&C coach or sports scientist first. And what he was referencing that and saying that we as S&C and sports scientists can set the tone for that session, whether it be negative or positive.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you and get your views on it in terms of what you think some important behaviours are to get the tone of that session to be what we want it to be.
It's a brilliant question, and I think Gary's point is really astute. I think I don't know if we spoke about this when we spoke last time on it, Ben, but I said I've seen so many that I often think that cultures can be undermined by support staff, and I'd include myself or, like you say, S&C or the fitness coaches in that they can undermine it or they can build it. That I've seen. I remember many years ago being in a coaching box with one coaching team, and I came up with the idea of describing the group as either truth tellers or time tellers. And the reason was because the coach I was working with was under pressure, and he turned to his coaches during a game, and he went, "What do we do here? I'm thinking of doing this." And both of his assistants said to him, "There's 20 minutes left." I remember thinking, I could have told you that, and I don't know anything about the sport. What he was looking for was somebody to say to him, I think this is an idea, or I don't think you're doing this, or just to challenge his thinking and speak the truth to him. Now, the reality was the culture that was there was they didn't feel confident enough to speak up to him, and therefore they were just sort of felt the need to say something, so they just told him the time. And I think it's the reason I mentioned that in answering your question is that I think that there needs to be an investment long before you're asking S&C coaches how they set the tone. There needs to be an understanding of what the tone is and how they can contribute to it. So they're not just there to as participants, they're there to shape it themselves. So I think there's an element of understanding, well, what are the non-negotiable behaviours that define your culture? And then when you see it being adhered to, catch people in But when you see people not doing it, don't be afraid to catch them out. And you need to have that confidence to call out behaviours when they're not happening. But also that confidence comes from knowing that the head coach and the decision makers at the club will have you back. So I'd encourage anyone that if you want to understand what the tone is, go and ask the coaches and the other people that are responsible for the culture, what are our non-negotiable behaviours? And then you can work out how you go about setting the tone for that. I'll give you an example again that comes from the podcast that we interviewed. We got invited to go to the home of Mauricio Pochettino, the Argentine that was in charge at Spurs. Now, I should just say, I've never been to a house where it took me 5 minutes to walk up the driveway before, but but that's, I mean, it was a grand old house, but more importantly, he was such a warm and welcoming bloke that you couldn't help but sort of be engaged by him. And he was speaking about one of the things that he does to set the tone. He did it at Espanyol and at Southampton, but now does it or did it at Spurs. Was that he's got 3 non-negotiable behaviours. The first one is positive energy, so everyone has to bring positive energy to the training ground. The second one is you have to have the right attitude, so it's about taking accountability. If things don't go right, there's no finger pointing, you just hold your hand up. And then the third one is you've got to be a team player. And he said that one of the ways that he felt it was incumbent on him to set the tone was he had a sofa moved right opposite the doorway when the players turned up at the training ground. And he said every morning he'd go and sit on the sofa with a cup of tea. He said that he'd wait for the players to come in. And he saw it as his role to shake the hand of every player that they came in. And he said in that handshake moment, when I look in their eyes and shake the hand, I can get a sense of what kind of energy they're bringing into the training ground that day. So my question was, well, what do you do if it's negative energy? He said, well, that's why I'm sat on the sofa. So the players, come and sit down with me here. What's happening? What's going on for you? Why are you behaving like this? And he said, then it's the human element of it. Might be something going on at home or with the kids or something personal. He said, and we can try and work it out. So by the time they go into that dressing room, they're demonstrating the behaviours that we need. And he said, and he said, and we'll spend as long as we need to get to that place. Now, he was the one that articulated a phrase that we spoke about last time, which was, eventually, if you can't sign up to these behaviours, this is where the FIFO effect kicks in. And it saw it as his role of, you either fit in and adopt these behaviours or fuck off and go somewhere else. But the way he explained it was a really nice way of articulating how the FO bit doesn't have to be fractious or aggressive. His point was, he said, you know what, if those behaviours aren't right for you, we need to help you find somewhere that is. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means that you're not going to thrive within this culture. But you owe it to yourself that you find a culture where you can thrive, that do accept your version of behaviours. So he was really clear at how he could set the tone as a coach in doing that. And then he said, and while I'm doing that, I can rely on my support staff to set up the training session that day, knowing that those 3 behaviours are what we expect because I've clarified it from the start. So I'm sorry I've taken a long time to answer that question, Ben, but I think to go back to it, I think before you can know as support staff or S&C coaches how to set the tone, you need to know what the non-negotiable behaviours are, because otherwise some of these responses can look like gimmicks. Do you know what I mean? If they're being done in isolation from what's going on elsewhere, it starts to look like a gimmick or a fad rather than a joined up process of understanding how culture can be a competitive advantage.
No, it ties in perfectly with our previous episode with Dave Tenney, who's a high performance director now at Austin. He said the exact same thing. He said he's going into a new role, and one of the first things he's going to ask is what they expect from him, and what they expect. That is going to tie into exactly the same sort of thing, those non-negotiables. So no, I think that answer's great, and it makes complete sense that we can't be setting things that we don't know what we're trying to work towards.
Yeah, I mean, be careful of gimmickry. That's one of my big things that I go into so many clubs or teams, and you see gimmicks like my pet peeve is when like you go into gyms where they've got like what are supposed to be inspirational quotes on the wall, winners never quit and quitters never win and things like that. And I say, yes, they do. I know plenty of winners that have quit. So it doesn't make sense. So what are you trying to get here that you stick at something even if it's not right for you? So and I'm being pedantic there and picking on a quote like that, but you say get it down because it's just noise. If you're going to put anything up on the wall, communicate your standards. Tell people the behaviours, the non-negotiables. When you're in this environment, this is what we expect of you. Don't just rely on the gimmick of a quote or a picture. You tell people these are the rules, this is the standards that we have here.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you mentioned something just a few minutes ago about confidence as a coach. And this is something that I wanted to ask about because, again, just to give a bit of context, we talk about sports science a lot. We talk about improving the importance or the way that people perceive sports science and S&C. And I think one thing behind that is that we need to back ourselves, have a bit more self-belief and confidence in the impact we can have on performance. So self-belief and confidence is I know it can be a massive area of conversation, and I don't want to take up too much of your time on it, but I just wanted to get your thoughts behind it on what we need to be wary of as practitioners.
Yeah, okay. Well, to summarize it in a couple of words, confidence comes from evidence. So for you to feel confident in something, you need to have evidence that you know you're capable of it or that it's possible. So how do you start finding the evidence that therefore allows confidence to scaffold from it? Well, there's a really simple exercise that anyone can do on this. And I encourage this so often with teams is to say, do a simple exercise. And I call it success leaves clues. So go and find the evidence. So sit down and go, who is the best example of a recipient of my work? Or if you're thinking about from a team point of view, what's the best game you've ever played, or what's the best season you've ever had? You set the parameters of where the investigation takes place, but start by looking at when you're good, why are you good, and find evidence of that, and then from that, confidence then starts to come. So don't just take it for granted. Don't just dismiss it. Do a proper exploration of that success. What were the behaviors? How did we cope under pressure? How did we respond to adversity? How did we communicate? Do a proper analysis, because what you'll find there is the evidence that allows you to then know that becomes who you are. That's your identity. That then feeds into your whole way of operating. So it's a very sort of succinct answer, and like you say, we could talk for a long time on it, but find the evidence of when you're good, why are you good, that enables you then to build on it. And then I think when you have confidence, I think one of the sort of consequences of that is you then start being a bit kinder to yourself. And when you're kinder to yourself, that allows you to learn. So when something goes wrong, the roof doesn't fall in on you. You go, I can't do it. You go, you know what, it didn't work well that time, but that doesn't mean that I'm a bad coach or that I can't do this job. And therefore you can then work out, so what do I need to do better? How do I fix it next time? Mm-hmm. So I think there's lots of subsequent knock-on effects of having confidence, but it starts from finding the evidence of it.
I love that. I think that's really good, really beneficial. So thanks for that.
No, thank you.
Damien, I'm really wary of your time. I don't want to take up too much.
No, go on. I'm enjoying it. It's nice to catch up again.
I could do this all day, to be fair. But I just wanted to take you into some of the quick fire questions that we've been asking.
Oh, go on. Yeah.
So the first one is, I always ask coaches who your biggest influences are in your career so far.
Ah, wow. Okay. I'm going to be biased on this. I'm going to talk about my dad. I made reference to him earlier, but long before I was born, my dad had set up a boxing gym in North Manchester in the Collyhurst area, which is where he grew up. And he'd left school at 15 with no formal education. He was an illegitimate child born to an Irish Catholic family. So in the post-war Manchester, that was a real stigma. And he'd sort of gone into boxing himself. He had no father figure, and he got himself quite badly hurt doing it. And it was a driver to almost be a father figure to people that he'd never had, and also to go into a sport that he loved, that made such a real difference. So he was doing it long before I was born, and he became the first Manchester man to train world champions. He had the numerous guys that went on to become Olympic, British, European, Commonwealth, and world champions that came through his gym. But it was he wrote a number of books to raise funds for the club. But it was his impact on life. So a couple of years ago, Ben, Manchester Council named a road after him in the Colliers part of town, and when in sort of tribute to his impact. Now my dad's quite poorly now; he's got advanced dementia. So, but when we had the event, like Andy Burnham, the mayor, came down to unveil the road, and there was about 300 people turned up. And I would estimate that I'd say 90% of the people that turned up to pay tribute to him had never set foot in a boxing ring, but they'd set foot in the gym. And what they wanted to come and pay tribute to was the impact of going into that gym had had on their lives in terms of teaching them values that they'd taken forward as parents, as partners, as professionals in other aspects. And I just feel incredibly blessed that that was my childhood, that was my background. So to grow up in an environment like that and to be able to see him at work and see the impact of it has given me like a huge appreciation for the work of coaches, and it's driven a lot of the work that I do now. I know how hard the job is, I know how lonely it can be, and I know how demanding it is. So a big driver for me is to almost be a support for those coaches that I saw my dad desperately needed when he was going on to do it. So I'm going to be biased there, but I'll talk about my dad.
No, I think that's great. I'd encourage people to go and listen to episode 11 as well, because I know you talk about him in that episode as well. So yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. And then the next one, Damien, in terms of your biggest strength as a practitioner.
Oh, wow. Now this challenges, because then, despite what I was saying about being kind, a natural aversion then kicks in to go, God, does that sound big-headed if you start talking about your strengths? So I'm sure there's lots of people feel that way. Wow. I'd say I have some trademark behaviours that I don't compromise on. So if I can explain that, I think that then will answer the question of what if I've got a strength, I'd consider them to be. The first one is I try and come at everything through a lens of kindness and understanding and empathy, because I think if you're kind to yourself, you can be kind to others. And if you're kind to others, you can accept that people make mistakes. We've all got flaws. Things can go wrong, and it doesn't necessarily define the person that they are. So I try and do everything through kindness, first of all. The second thing I try and do is try and do things where I feel it'll be fun. Because if it's fun, you feel engaged. And if you're engaged, you'll give you time extra and things like that, which is, you know, a big reason why I was really flattered that you asked me to come on originally and then come back on again, because it's great fun talking to you. And then the third thing is that I'm driven to try and make a positive difference. So if I go into an environment where you don't feel you can make an impact, or you just being a yes man or something like that, I'll walk away. So I don't compromise on that. That if I feel that I can't go into an environment where kindness is valued, where people see it as a weakness, or where it doesn't seem like it's going to be fun but more a slog, or if you can't make a positive difference, I won't go and work in an environment like that, and I won't offer any value. But if I can meet those three needs, I feel I can bring some strengths to a team or a culture in that way.
Brilliant. And then the next one, this was probably, I put this one in place because of lockdown, and a lot of coaches have been through this. So, and I know you've been crazy busy, so it might not be as applicable. But what's the best bit of like CPD that you've seen or done recently? So whether that be like a webinar, whether it be like the podcast, just speaking to the guests that you guys have spoke to, is there anything that stands out for you?
Yeah, so I'm a voracious reader. Like my wife says I'm a secret geek, but even from being a kid, I always just loved reading. That's my escape, and I'll read widely and read really variedly. Now, doing the podcast has been really great for that, because when we know we've got a guest coming up, I'll go and explore something about their work or things like that that do it. But yeah, there was a book I read just before lockdown that had quite a significant impact. I was doing some work out in Poland, and I was at Manchester Airport passing through, and I saw this little thin book called Stop Reading the News by this writer called Rolf Dobelli. And I picked it up and I went, oh, that looks interesting. So I bought it and read it. And I was on a quick visit to Poland, so I'd finished it by the time I got back. And it was just a really compelling reason to say, stop taking your news sources from news sources. Said, anything that you need to know will find its way to you. Like, you don't have to go looking for it. It'll find its way. So if something is really important, somebody will come along and make you aware of it. Beyond that, it's just noise. And it was a really significant thing for me in terms of that I felt I was going down rabbit hole a bit of, like, social media was dominating. I was responding to notifications and things like that. So from a CPD point of view, this book was really good because it forced me to free up time by sort of stop going on social media, stop reading the news. That meant I had more time to go back to my original passion, which is just reading as widely and as variedly as I could.
No, I love that. That's class. And then the final ones, mate, is, and I know this might be hard to narrow down again, but what do you think one of the best traits are of a coach, or of a coach to have?
Wow. Okay. Can I answer a few, or do you need just one?
No, a few, yeah.
Yeah. Humility. So the ability to ask questions and not get carried away with your successes, but be humble enough to accept that everybody's got something to contribute and be open to new ideas. Something around emotional intelligence is just not up for compromise. This is the ability to, it goes back to that phrase I've used about kindness and empathy and understanding of the person behind the athlete. And then I'd say something around energy. So bringing positive energy to it. And then linked to that is something around integrity. So you have to be really clear of who you stand for. Because when I go and speak to so many players and I say to them, what do you look for in a coach? What's the best coach you've ever had? They always come back with two things: consistency and transparency. Tell me what you stand for and then just do it. So I might not agree with it, but you've told me what you stood for and then you applied it. And that creates that idea of integrity, that people know where they stand with you.
I love that. Yeah, that's class. And then the same question, but for a player.
Wow. Okay. I think so. Again, humility is key for a player. That if you only want to listen to people that are in your world, you sort of miss out on an awful lot of information. So humility is key there. And I'd say something around that idea of being able to take advice from other people. So that's the emotional intelligence bit. Be open to advice, but from a wide range of sources, but be discerning about it as well. Not everybody's right, but at least give them the courtesy of listening to them. And then I'd say invest in your craft. Be obsessed about it. Don't play at it. Do it properly. If you're gonna go after high performance, understand that you have to invest time, energy, and commitment to it. Brilliant.
Absolutely quality. I knew I'd enjoy this one, Damien, but that's been absolutely class. So thank you very much.
Oh, no, pleasure. No, I've loved it. Thank you.
Just the final thing, mate. I always ask where to direct people, like if they're just to follow your work and stuff. And I know there's been a few changes in terms of social media. So do you want to just give a little update?
Yeah. So earlier this year, I mentioned that book by Rolf Dobelli about Stop Reading the News. I sort of came to a decision. I'd been sort of playing around with it for a while, but I just decided to remove myself from most of social media where I could, so like Twitter, Facebook. I've had to go on Instagram because I do a live Q&A with Jake when we launch in the podcast. But beyond that, I'm not active on it hardly at all. And that's not to be snobbish about any of this stuff. It was just There was a couple of reasons by it. I'd read the Ralph DeBelli book, but I'd also read a brilliant paper by a guy called Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist at Virginia University. And the paper he wrote has subsequently become a book. The book's called The Coddling of the American Mind, where he says that social media does three things to us in terms of our view of the world. The first thing is we divide everything up into two terms. It's right or wrong, good or evil. And he said what that doesn't allow us to do is to see that there's subtlety, there's nuances, that not everything is in one of those two camps. But social media demands that you either hate Donald Trump or you love him. Why can't I just not care? Why can I just not have an opinion? Well, you can't play in that position. So that's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is, he says, it almost becomes an echo chamber. So you only hear your own views reinforced back to you on social media. So, and then the third thing is, he says, we mistake people's feelings for facts. So people then that you might say something and people then feel offended by it or things like that, rather than accepting that it's just a different opinion. So there was that sort of prompted me, and I was starting to think that maybe if I wanted to keep like learning and developing, social media wasn't maybe the best platform to do that. And then on a personal footing, my little lad is only 11 and he's starting high school, so he was asking if we'd get him a phone. And one of the first things he started talking about was going on Instagram and things like that. And I was just adamant it wasn't a healthy environment for any child to go on. And I thought, I need to role model it. I can't tell him that he can't do it when he gets a phone. And yet he could look at my phone and see that I was on social media or distracted. So it's a long-winded way of explaining that. I just decided to remove myself from it and thought, if people need to get in touch with me, they can. There's a website called liquidthinker.com where they're welcome to go on there. There's a contact page and it gets sent on to me. So there's a lady that receives it for me that does some work for me, and she just sends them on. So if people need to get in touch, I promise I'll always respond within 48 hours. If somebody does the courtesy of sending an email, I'll always take the trouble to respond. But that, to me, has freed up so much time and mental space that I can do the stuff that I enjoy rather than feel that I'm being distracted by something that's not always so helpful. So again, I'm giving long-winded answers, so sorry about this, Ben, but yeah, there's a website called liquidthinker.com and there's a contact page there. If anyone's got any questions from what we spoke about today, or maybe want some more information or whatever, you're more than welcome to get in touch, and I promise I'll always do the courtesy of replying to anyone that's kind enough to do that.
Brilliant. And if anyone has been living in a cave and not come across the podcast yet, then I recommend that you guys go and give it a listen, because honestly, I'm not just saying it because Damien's on the podcast, but it's getting to my favorite podcast at the moment. There's such a mix of guests, and the job that you and Jake do is brilliant. So
thank you.
Yeah, keep up the good work, mate.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. I feel like I think what it's given me is a real appreciation of the skill that you do on this podcast, Ben. Like, it's the first time I've ever done anything like this, of hosting it, and where you're trying to listen to the guest and do the courtesy of listening to them, and then trying to think of a appropriate follow-up and trying to be sensitive to it is a skill that I don't feel I've mastered, but it certainly gives me an appreciation of just what you're doing. And thank you for having me on. And I said it at the start, I'll say it again, congratulations on churning out 106 episodes so far that are filled with sort of really insightful questions and coming at it with sensitivity and discretion. So appreciate you inviting me on.
Not a problem. It's a pleasure to have you on, mate, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Love that. Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Yeah, let's not leave it as long this time.
Definitely. Thanks a lot, Damien.
Cheers, Ben.